Well, this morning, instead of doing our usual type Bible lesson where we go verse by verse, we're going to be doing a summary. We're going to be doing mostly a summary of Abraham's life and then of the way God moves in me and in us. In chapter 12, God calls Abraham and gives him the covenant. And in the same chapter, God directs him, says, I'm going to give you the land of Canaan, and he tells him to abide in the land. Back when I was in Bible college, the vice president had a famous sermon that he would do called Abide in the Land. And I never heard it. But I'm taking the gist of it was God told Abraham to go to the land of Canaan and live there. Well, when hardship came up, what did Abraham do?
Egypt.
He went down to Egypt, where he then didn't trust God to take care of him, and he asked Sarah to say, you're my sister. And Sarah, of course, being a very beautiful woman, was adopted by Pharaoh, and he wanted her as a wife. And God had to bring plagues on the Egyptians to deliver them. Okay, God just gave him the covenant, and Abraham didn't exercise faith. Okay, so that's a faith test that he failed. He should have stayed where he was. In chapter 13, God reasserts his promise of the land promise, and he says, you'll have children like the dust of the earth. There'll be very many. Okay, so God is reassuring Abraham that he is going to have a posterity. And of course, to Abraham, what is the most important thing in his life?
Isaac.
A posterity. Yeah, he wants his family line to continue. Okay. Then in chapter 14, Lot gets kidnapped by the 5 kings, led by Chedorlaomer, and Abraham raises a small army, attacks them at night, and delivers Lot, and then pays his tenth to Melchizedek. In chapter 15, again you have the promise of children, except this time God is reaffirming the covenant with them, and he says your children will be like the stars in the sky. If you can count them, then you can count your children. And he also guarantees Abraham, I will be your shield. And in verse 6, it says, and Abraham believed God, and it was counted to him for righteousness. God reaffirms the covenant, and chapter 15 is where he makes the prophecy about his children will go down to Egypt and be held there for 400 years, but in the 4th generation they would come back. So now Abraham has an even more immediate promise of what's going to happen to his children. But does he have a son? No. Right. And in chapter 16, he does his second failure of faith. God has promised him he's going to have children, but he takes Sarah's advice and he goes into Hagar, and he has a son who is of his body, but not of Sarah's. Ishmael is not the promised son. And of course, having this other kid in the house has raised problems, and Abraham has to deal with it. God does go back and bless Hagar and says, I'll make Ishmael into a mighty nation also. In chapter 17, God reestablishes the covenant with Abraham, and he gives them the covenant of circumcision. You and all your children shall be circumcised on the 8th day. Okay, Abraham got circumcised that day at 99 years old, and Ishmael was 13. If you've ever wondered where the Muslim circumcision at 13 comes from, that's where it was, because that's when Ishmael got circumcised. In chapter 17, God comes back to reestablish the covenant with Abraham, and Abraham falls on his face laughing. How am I, 99 years old, going to have a son? And God changes his name from Abram to Abraham. So he's not just the father of many, he's the father of many nations. God also commands him, be blameless, walk before me in blamelessness. And if you look in your side notes over there, it means to walk in integrity. Now, we've discussed the idea of integrity before. What does it mean to be a person of integrity? It means that everything in your being is dedicated to one purpose. Your thoughts, your emotions, your actions all work together. That's what it means to have integrity. A person can be totally evil and have integrity because they're all working towards the same one goal. Okay, Abraham was told to have integrity before God because he's going to teach his children his ways. And God promises him that he's going to keep the covenant because Sarah is going to have a son. That's where the three men meet with Abraham and Sarah. And God promises next year when I come by this time, you'll have a son. And in chapter 18, Sarah laughs. Okay, Abraham had his laugh. Now it's time for Sarah to have her laugh of unbelief. Okay, she's old. She knows she's not going to have any kids. It's past that time for anybody under normal circumstances. And so when she hears God's promise that she'll have a child in a year from now, she laughs. In chapter 19, it explains why, not chapter 19, chapter 18, verse 19, it explains why Abraham was chosen, because he's going to teach his children God's ways. He's going to pass it on. Okay, and that's the goal, is God wants to have a nation full of people who will walk in his ways. And in verse 14 and verse 25, we find two principles there that are they're at the top of the list of God's attributes. In verse 14, the question is asked, is anything too hard for Yahweh? And of course the implied answer is no. And in verse 25, the next question comes up, will not the judge of all the earth do what is right? Okay, so you have two characteristics of God there. You have his omnipotence and you have his justice. Okay, and those are two key factors that people have to deal with when they come to God. R.C. Sproul said one time that there were three things that the unbeliever hates about God. One, he's all-powerful, he's just, and three, he doesn't change. Okay, if God could change, you could bargain with him, but he doesn't change, so there's no bargaining. And Abraham prays for Lot there. And again, this prayer is kind of I don't know what kind of prayer this is. It kind of sounds unbelievable because he turns to God and says, you're going to destroy Sodom because it's evil. Okay, one of the primary evils of Sodom was homosexuality. Okay, you had men trying to beat down Lot's door because they wanted to rape the angels that were inside. Okay, Lot stands up as a righteous man and defends them.
He throws his daughters out the door.
Yeah,
daughter and just concubine.
Yeah, he put the daughters outside as an offering, which was very much a self-sacrifice on his part, but he had to defend the honor. If you understand the household covenant of the Middle East, if someone comes into your house and they eat with you, you are bound by life and death to defend them. He did everything he could to defend them, and that's why he's called a righteous man later on. But Abraham starts off with, if there's 50 righteous people in Sodom, will you spare the city? And he finally bargains with God down, says, well, if there's one righteous person, won't you save him? And so God saved Lot and his children. In chapter 19, you have the story of Lot and Sodom. His wife obviously really loved Sodom because she had to look back while it was being destroyed, and she got judged for that. She didn't trust God that he was doing something really righteous. She wanted what was there. Let's face it, how many of us really love the luxuries of the city? I remember we took him to Border one time when I was in high school, and he was from New York. And he hated Florida. He loved New York City because there's so much to do in New York City. There's nothing to do here. Well, I grew up here, and I certainly found things to do, you know. It's what you're used to. But then in chapter 20, Abraham again leaves the land, and he moves into the land of the Philistines, and we have a repeat of Sarah, say you're my sister, Abimelech the king likes Sarah. Now, I must say that Sarah must have been a really outstandingly beautiful woman if at 99 years old, a foreign king wants her. Okay? And there are some women that age very well, and there are women that don't age well. Anyway, Abraham gets himself into the same situation, and if you look at, if he was told to abide in the land, and he leaves, he's already failed the faith test, because then he didn't stay where God told him to be. And so he runs into the same problem again. And again, compromises and says, say you're my sister, so that I don't get killed. He's assuming that nobody in the pagan world has any standards whatsoever. But both Pharaoh and Abimelech were angry with him because they said, if we'd known she was your wife, we wouldn't have touched her. Okay? But you lied. You lied to protect yourself.
But wasn't he afraid the first time that the king would kill him if he thought it was his wife to get his wife?
Yeah, both times.
Yeah,
He didn't trust God.
he didn't trust God in that.
Yeah.
And when you mentioned integrity, I thought integrity meant like honesty and stuff. Because when someone says, "Oh, someone's a man or a woman of integrity," I thought it meant honesty.
It does.
If you're on the side of good, yes. If you're on the side of evil, you can be a person of integrity because you've totally dedicated yourself to evil. What it means is you're integrated. Everything about you is integrated towards one goal. Okay, integrity in general means to be an honest person, but that's because you're living in a Christian culture. Okay, if you were living in a communist culture, a communist of integrity would be anti-Christian and pro the government. Okay, and they could have their whole person dedicated to that goal. They would be a person of integrity in that everything in them is dedicated to a particular point. Does that make sense?
Okay, yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Because I've always heard it in a good way. Also, it doesn't matter about integrity. It's I always heard it in a good way.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah. Well, it's a matter of definition. Most people don't go into the real definitions of definitions. Okay. So again, he runs into the problem with Abimelech and his sister. And in chapter 21, Isaac is born, and Isaac's name means laughter, which is because now she's laughing. She says, shall I finally have the joy of having a child, even though I'm so old? And she does. God gives her Isaac, and she names him Laughter, which is also kind of a haunting reminder of what Abraham and Sarah both did. They both laughed at God at the promise. So it's like, yeah, we laughed because we didn't believe, but now here's the fulfillment. Okay, and we're naming him Laughter because of the joy that comes because God kept his promise. Now, mind you, it's been many years since God made that promise. It's at least 25 years since God promised Abraham a son. And you have to ask, how much patience and faith does it take to go 25 years without having your prayer answered? Okay, and that's where Abraham finally comes to full faith. And in chapter 22, he passes the faith test supremely. Okay, because in chapter 22, God asks him to sacrifice Isaac. Isaac is the whole point of Abraham's life. Okay, this is what he waited 25 years for, and now it's been we don't know how many years, but Isaac is not a little baby being sacrificed. He's at least a young adult and possibly a full adult. Okay, and
Probably around the same age as Jesus.
That's what I heard.
oh, it makes sense. Yeah, because it's a picture of Yeshua offering himself as a sacrifice. And we've talked before about the story of the Akedah, the binding of Isaac. He allows himself to be bound and offers as a sacrifice, but then God says, no. And God says, now I know that you've believed. Okay, and
But the other hero of the story that doesn't get talked about a lot is Isaac. Isaac agreed.
yeah, well,
He was willing.
and that was the point I
So
was just
Jesus
making.
was willing too.
I'm going to read a couple verses out of chapter 22, if I can get the pages to turn.
Yeah, like I don't know. But you also got to think of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego too. They were also heroes.
Yes, but they don't. But they're not for hundreds of years later.
That's
Right.
true.
Yeah, and chapter 22, verses 15 through 18 is what I'm going to read. I guess it'd be better if I was in Genesis instead of Exodus.
What do you mean?
Might make more sense.
You might follow along a little bit closer, yeah. Okay. Then the angel of Yahweh called to Abraham a second time from heaven, and he said, "By myself I have sworn, declares Yahweh, because you have done this thing and have not withheld your son, your only son. Indeed, I will greatly bless you, and I will greatly multiply your seed as the stars of heaven, and as the sand which is on the seashore, and your seed shall possess the gates of their enemies. In your seed all the nations of the earth shall be blessed, because you have obeyed my voice." Okay. Isn't that a reiteration of the covenant in chapter 12? Yeah. But God has reaffirmed the covenant at least 3 times, and now here's the final thing. Okay, it's firm. It's sure now. And if you remember in the Middle East, if you mean to get a point across, you say it 3 or 4 times. Well, God has reassured Abraham now at least 4 times the covenant is going to be with you, and because you obeyed my voice and were willing to sacrifice the most important thing in your life, it says the covenant's guaranteed. I've always felt like all of us go through multiple levels of faith tests, okay? And it seems to me like at the end of your life, somewhere in your life, you're going to be asked to give up the thing you most value and trust God to take care of it, okay? God has always used 2x4s to move me from one place to another. Evidently, I don't take hints. And oddly enough, too, God has always used injustice to move me. I'm not sure why that is. I think it's because he wanted me to learn to trust him, that he's in control of all situations. And the situation that moves me is irrelevant. Okay, it doesn't matter if it's unjust. He's going to move me to where he wants me.
What if it wasn't my choice?
Well, you know, if you aren't willing to take hints, God will move you through harsher means.
Well, no, I didn't know because I had to sacrifice, something, and I didn't know I had to because I didn't know until it actually happened. Like, I had to sacrifice my best friend, but I didn't know that until he died.
Yeah, and we quite often don't know what's going on. When I was first praying about going to seminary, I was being offered a job as a firefighter. And I was a shoo-in because I'd already worked there. They knew me, and my best friend had been president of the union. So I was a shoo-in. I was guaranteed the job. Except I went to a polygrapher to go through the formality, and he declared me a drug addict, even though I offered to give him a sample of anything he wanted. And I was very unjustly denied the job.
Oh my
Okay.
gosh.
God was leading me, forcing me to go to seminary. Okay.
Basically getting you that shovel going.
But I didn't like the way he did it. And I fussed and fumed about the injustice of the situation for years. Okay, because I was more concerned about what didn't matter than where God was leading me. I wasn't looking forward, I was looking backwards. Okay, later on at UMC, I was passed over for promotion for someone who was completely useless. And then I wasn't allowed to do the CEUs, and I was forced to move to Florida. Which is where I kind of wanted to be, but it would have been more comfortable just to stay in Mississippi. And then when I was seeking ordination in the Presbyterian Church, one of the elders, who was really a close friend, I considered him my best friend at that time, came in as one of the elders and They had done no background checks on me at all. I'd given them a whole bunch of people to call and talk to and all kinds of references. They did nothing. But this one elder came in, and after I'd driven with him one night, I said, I need to give these guys some background on me. So I told him about my background experiences, successes and failures. And there were more failures than successes. But he heard about me talking about one Sunday school lesson that I taught where people actually stood up and applauded after the Sunday school lesson. Okay, I hadn't taken into account that he was an introvert with an inferiority complex. He could not even take a compliment, much less accept that someone else could say something good about themselves. Okay, so he took my giving me my history as me being a braggart, came in and told them all that I was a braggart and I didn't deserve to be ordained. So I was essentially thrown out of the church that I was seeking ordination with. And then come along here, God wants to move me. After 13 years at Lowe's, my job suddenly disappears. Now, I didn't know where I was supposed to go, and eventually it seemed like it was going to be over at Spartan, but then a misunderstanding arose there last week, and I'm no longer employed there. And again, God is leading me through injustices, but this time, I'm not fretting and fuming about what happened. I'm looking forward and saying, God, where's it you want me to go? God has finally granted me the faith to look at things from His perspective instead of just looking backwards at what went wrong. Okay? So what I'm saying is everybody goes through these kind of tests. And just because you fail a faith test does not mean God is done with you. Okay? Look at Abraham. How many faith tests did he fail? Okay?
A lot.